They said she'd never stop running. They hadn't seen where she ended up. The pie was still warm. The walk had been 2 miles. He opened the door like he was expecting weather. He got something else entirely. Neither one said a word for 4 full seconds. That was the beginning. But we'll get to that. First, you need to understand what the town of Elk Fall, Montana had already decided about Clara Dunning. Because they had decided. Long before she walked 2 miles down a dirt road carrying a pie she had no business baking for a man she had no business visiting, the verdict was in. Too proud, too stubborn, too young to be that hard, and too old to still be alone. She ran her dead father's 320-acre ranch by herself for 3 full years after he passed, and in that time she refused every offer to sell, refused every man who rode up her road with good intentions and better land, and refused to do the one thing Elk Fall wanted most from a 26-year-old woman with no husband and no help. She refused to fail. And that, more than anything, is what bothered them. The town kept a catalog. Clara Dunning won't sell to Patterson. Clara Dunning turned down the Hargrove boy, and he's got riverfront acreage. Clara Dunning was seen at the general store buying 40 pounds of wire and a man's pair of work gloves. These observations collected on the shelf of the community's memory, like jars of preserves nobody intended to open but everybody wanted to keep. A woman's grocery list in Elk Fall was public record. A woman's loneliness was public property. Elk Fall in 1887 was a town small enough to bruise. One general store where Frank Meacham wrote every purchase in a ledger he kept beneath the counter. And don't think for a second he didn't know what it meant when someone bought 2 pounds of coffee instead of 1. One gathering hall for the Sunday suppers where every eye tracked who sat where and near whom. 3 families owned most of the valley, the Pattersons, the Hargroves, and the Meachams themselves, and everyone else existed in the spaces between their fences. Clara existed in those spaces. 14 head of cattle, 11 miles of fence line, $47 in annual property tax she paid, on time, every time, counted out in coins on Frank Meacham's counter while he watched her like she was performing a magic trick he didn't believe in. Now, Thomas Cole. You didn't meet Thomas Cole. Thomas Cole met you, if he decided you were worth the effort, which he usually didn't. 52 years old, widower, ran 480 acres north of Clara's property line, land so well kept it looked like it had been ironed. Lost his wife Sarah 11 years ago and hadn't attended a Sunday supper since. His fences were perfect. Not good, not solid, perfect. Every post plumb, every wire tensioned to the exact give where your palm pressed flat and felt resistance without bite. He spoke to no one beyond what business required, and what business required was very little, because Thomas Cole had arranged his grief into a schedule and followed it like gospel. He rose at 4. He worked until the light quit. He ate alone. He slept alone. He repeated this every single day for 11 years. And if you'd asked anyone in Elk Fall about Thomas Cole, they would have told you he was doing fine. Which is what people say about a man they've stopped looking at. Clara's ranch told a different story than Thomas's. Honest, but different. The south fence line sagged where half-clay soil had shifted after spring melt. Posts that had been true in October listing 2-3 degrees by April, pulling the wire into lazy curves that a determined cow could test. The barn roof had been patched twice, cedar shingles over pine over the original spruce, and it was holding, but barely, the way a man holds a conversation he wants to leave. The root cellar, though. The root cellar was immaculate. 40 jars of preserved tomatoes, 22 pounds of dried beans in canvas sacks raised off the floor on pine slats. Everything labeled, everything counted. She kept it all in a leather-bound notebook, palm-sized, edges worn soft and flour-dusted, tucked in the pocket of that faded, rust-brown canvas jacket she wore every day of every season. Every expense, every hay bale purchased and fed, every fence post replaced with the date, the location, and the cost of the wire. The numbers in that notebook didn't argue. They didn't have opinions. They just sat there, quiet and absolute. And when Frank Meacham suggested once that maybe she should consider what her father's land was really worth, Clara pulled the notebook from her jacket pocket, opened it to a page she didn't need to search for, and read him 3 numbers that made the worth of her land perfectly clear. She didn't raise her voice. She closed the notebook. She bought her wire. The pie. Let me tell you about the pie. Cold butter, not cool, cold, straight from the creek box, cut with 2 knives in a chipped ceramic bowl until the mixture looked like rough gravel, pale yellow crumbs the size of small peas, nothing smooth, nothing blended. Ice water added 1 tablespoon at a time, the dough pressed together with the heel of her hand, never kneaded, never worked, because overworked dough makes a crust that fights your teeth instead of giving way. Wine-sap apples from the 2 trees her father planted the year she was born, sliced a 1/4 inch thin with a paring knife she sharpened every 3rd use. Lattice, woven, not laid. Each strip threaded over and under so the top breathed and the juices thickened instead of drowning the crust. Cream brushed across the lattice with a torn square of clean muslin. Raw sugar dusted from her fingers, the crystals catching light from the kitchen window. Her stove had a dead spot at the rear left where heat pooled and died. 3 weeks ago, the first pie she'd baked had burned there, 1 black quarter she'd cut away and eaten herself, standing at the counter, angry at a stove for doing what stoves do. This time she rotated the pie twice, checked the color at 20 minutes, again at 35. The pie was perfect. She wrapped it in cloth, walked 2 miles down the road to Thomas Cole's porch, set it on the railing. He opened the door. Those pale green eyes looked straight into gray-blue ones, and neither of them said a single word for 4 full seconds. Then she turned and walked back down the road, that dark auburn braid swaying between her shoulder blades, and Thomas Cole stood in the doorway holding the door open for another 10 seconds after she was gone, his thumb pressing slow circles against the brass case of a pocket watch on a tarnished chain. That was a Tuesday. Nobody knew it yet, but Tuesdays were about to mean something in Elk Fall. The following Tuesday, Clara walks the same 2 miles. Thomas finds 2 tin cups beside his stove that evening and doesn't remember setting out the second one. Now, I need you to sit with that for a second, because Thomas Cole is not a careless man. He is a man who has lived alone for 11 years in a house where every object has a fixed position, where the coffee tin sits 3 inches left of the stove edge and the single cup hangs on the same nail it has hung on since his wife died. A man like that does not accidentally set out a second cup. But a man like that will tell himself he did, because the alternative requires him to examine something he is not ready to examine. The pie came again. Wine-sap apple, same as the first. Same cloth wrapping, same spot on the porch railing, same absence of Clara by the time he opened the door. He brought it inside. He ate a slice standing at the counter and noticed she had adjusted something. The lattice was tighter this time, woven, not laid, each strip threaded over-under with a precision that made the crust hold its shape even after cutting. The first pie's lattice had been good, this one was better. She had corrected herself between Tuesdays, and she hadn't told anyone she'd done it. By the 3rd Tuesday, Thomas had coffee ready. Not for her. he told himself that. He simply made coffee at the time he always made coffee, which happened to be 40 minutes earlier than the time he had always made coffee for the past 11 years. The brass pocket watch on its tarnished chain came out of his vest pocket twice that morning. He rubbed the case with his thumb both times. The coffee was hot when the pie appeared. Clara was already walking back down the road by the time he opened the door, and the 2 tin cups were sitting beside the stove, and he stood there looking at them and decided he must have set them out while half asleep. He had categorized all of this carefully under the heading of good neighbor. It was a solid category. It required nothing of him. By the 4th Tuesday, the 2nd cup had coffee in it. Sunday supper at the Elk Fall Church Hall is a thing with its own physics. Long plank tables set end to end, benches on both sides, and a seating order nobody assigned but everybody obeys. Families cluster. Widows sit near widows. Young men with prospects sit where young women can see them without turning their heads. And at the far end of the last table, every single Sunday for longer than most people in that room have been alive, sits Ruth Ames. She is 5'1", white hair pinned in a low bun with 2 bone hairpins, a cream knit shawl clasped at her throat with a pewter brooch shaped like a plain circle. Her carved walking stick, dark with age and smooth from decades of use, leans against the bench beside her right hand. Her pale blue eyes are watery and sharp at the same time, which is a trick only women over 70 can pull off. And she watches everything in that room the way a barn cat watches a feed bin. Patient, still, and completely aware of every movement. She noticed Thomas took a second biscuit. He never takes a second biscuit. She noticed Clara arrived early and left late. Clara always arrives exactly on time and leaves before the coffee is cleared. Ruth said nothing. She broke her biscuit in half, ate it slowly, and watched. I will tell you now that Ruth Ames speaks exactly 3 times in this story, and every single time the room will change. Now, Henry Pace. Henry Pace is 30 years old, 5'10", sandy blonde hair parted on the left, light brown eyes that catch amber in the sun, and a small dimple in his left cheek that appears when he talks, which is often. He has good land, 640 acres south of the creek, inherited, clean, no liens. He has good teeth. He has a folded land survey map tucked inside his tan leather vest at all times, like some men carry a Bible. He is, by every measure the town of Elk Fall uses, the man Clara Dunning should marry. He rode up to Clara's south fence line on a Wednesday, not a Tuesday, because Henry Pace does not know that Tuesdays mean anything, and he sat his horse with his weight on one hip and his thumbs hooked in his belt and that dimple working, and he offered to buy her south 40 acres at a fair price. Fair by his math. Fair by any reasonable standard, honestly. Clara stood on her side of the fence, dark auburn braid past her shoulder blades, secured with rawhide, pale green eyes level and direct. The small leather-bound notebook in her left hand, edges worn soft and flour-dusted. She looked at him the way you look at a rain cloud that might pass over. The farm is not for sale. 6 words. No heat in them, no anger, just a door closing. Henry tipped his hat, smiled that dimple smile, and rode off down the road with his survey map and his good teeth and his absolute certainty that he'd be back. He'd be back. The fence needed work regardless. Clara's south line had 16 posts over a quarter mile, and 7 of them had shifted in the spring thaw. Half clay soil will do that. It holds tight when it's dry, swells when it's wet, and pushes posts sideways like it has personal opinions about where vertical should be. Thomas showed up the following Saturday without being asked. He brought a post hole digger, a tamping bar, and the quiet understanding that he was there to work, not to talk. Clara was already digging when he arrived, her scuffed tan boots planted wide, driving the digger into soil that fought back at every inch. The trick with half-clay ground is depth. You cannot stop at 18 inches and hope. You dig past the clay shelf. It sits at about 22 inches in that part of Montana, and you get into the gravel andite below, where drainage keeps the base from shifting when the freeze-thaw cycle starts. Then, you tamp in layers, not all at once. Bootfuls of rock first, then packed clay, then rock again, each layer stomped flat before the next one goes in. You build a post's foundation the way you build anything that has to last, one layer at a time. Thomas set the first post. He sighted down the line, stepped back, and sank it. It was 2 degrees off. Clara pressed her palm flat against the wood without looking up. East. One word. No judgment in it, just a fact, delivered the way you'd say the sun rises. Thomas looked at the post. He looked at her. He pulled the post, redug the hole a half-inch wider on the west side, reset it, tamped it in 3 layers, and sighted down the line again. The second post was perfect. Plumb and true, lined up with every post before it like they'd been placed by the same hand. He didn't say anything. Neither did she. But something shifted between them that was quieter than words and harder to undo. Neighbors rode past that week. They saw the new posts, fresh-cut cedar, bark still pale, tamped tight in dark clay. Nobody said a word about it until Sunday. That is how Elk Fall works. You see a thing, you hold it in your mouth like a cough during a sermon, and you wait for the right pew to let it out. The opinions were forming. 26 years between them. She'd been alone too long. He had no business being on her land. No reason anyone could name, and no reason anyone needed to, because the fence posts were visible from the road, and fence posts tell their own story. 6 Tuesdays in, Thomas corrects the angle on one of Clara's south fence posts, 2 degrees east, and neither of them mentions it. Before we go on, I want to know what country you're listening from today. Drop it in the comments, and if this story is keeping you company tonight, leave a like. It means more than you know. Now, the reason I tell you that is because of what happened the 7th Tuesday. The 7th Tuesday, Clara didn't bring pie. She brought a ledger problem. Her hay numbers didn't add up and she needed someone to check her math. Now, I want you to understand what this means. For 6 Tuesdays, Clara Dunning had crossed the property line between her land and Thomas Cole's land carrying a pie. That was the arrangement. That was the safe geometry of the thing. Pie is a gift. A gift can be left on a porch. A gift requires nothing except gratitude, and gratitude can be expressed from a distance. A ledger problem is not a gift. A ledger problem is a request, and a request means stepping inside. She knocked once on his door at 9:30 in the morning, and when he opened it, she held up the small leather-bound notebook, edges worn soft and flour-dusted, the spine cracked from use, and she said, "I need a second pair of eyes." That was the first time Clara Dunning crossed Thomas Cole's threshold. His kitchen was clean, spare. One wooden chair at the table, positioned with its back to the window so the morning light fell across whatever was in front of it. A second chair sat against the far wall with a wool coat draped over its back. Dark, heavy, folded once at the collar, and it had the particular stillness of an object that hasn't been touched in years. You know how you can tell. The dust doesn't settle on things that move. Clara sat in the second chair without asking. She pulled it to the table, coat and all, and opened her ledger to a page near the middle. Thomas didn't move the coat. He didn't say a word about it. He sat in his chair and looked at where her finger pointed. Here's what the numbers said. 14 head of cattle, each one consuming roughly 26 pounds of hay per day through winter, and in the Gallatin Valley in 1883, winter meant 150 days minimum, sometimes 170 if March decided to be cruel about it. Multiply that out. 14 head times 26 pounds times 150 days. That's 54,600 pounds of hay to get her herd through to spring grass. Clara had 48,000 pounds stored. She'd weighed it herself, bale by bale, recorded every number in that notebook in her small, square handwriting. She'd even noted which stack was cut in July versus August, because July hay holds more nutrient and August hay holds more stem, and she knew the difference mattered. The gap was 6,600 pounds, about $33 worth at current prices. She didn't have it. Thomas read the numbers. He followed her columns with one finger, his brass pocket watch shifting against its tarnished chain as he leaned forward. His thumb found the watch case and rubbed it once, the way it always did when he was thinking. He didn't speak. He didn't offer sympathy or advice or reassurance. He picked up the pencil she'd set on the table and he wrote a single number on the margin of her page. 7,200. The weight, in pounds, of hay sitting in his north barn. Unclaimed. Cut late and stacked high on a raised crib because Thomas Cole had lost cattle to bad winters before, and he kept surplus the way some men keep whiskey, not because he needed it now, but because he remembered needing it once. He set the pencil down. He didn't offer the hay. He just wrote the number where she could see it. Clara looked at it for a long time. Then she closed the notebook and put it back in her jacket pocket. That Sunday, Henry Pace showed up at the church supper. He sat near Clara. Of course he did. Sandy blonde hair parted clean on the left, trimmed above the ears, that small dimple pressing into his left cheek every time he opened his mouth. Polished brown leather boots that had never once been resoled. He had his folded land survey map tucked inside his tan leather vest like a man carrying a love letter he wrote to himself. He mentioned his 640 acres. He mentioned his new barn, built in August, cedar beams, tin roof. He mentioned his plan to run 200 head by spring. He said all of this the way a man lays cards on a table, one at a time, face up, waiting for applause. Every eye in that room tracked the distance between his shoulder and Clara's. Clara listened, her pale green eyes steady, her dark auburn braid falling past her shoulder blades, the strip of rawhide at its end brushing the back of her chair. She did not respond to any of it. Henry Pace had every quality a woman was supposed to want. Clara Dunning had never been very interested in supposed to. 3 nights later, a Wednesday, 2 in the morning, Thomas Cole stood at Clara's woodpile in the dark with a splitting maul and a lantern hung from a nail on the fence post. His feet were shoulder-width apart on the frozen ground, dominant hand low on the hickory handle, guide hand up near the head. He brought the maul up in an arc and let gravity do most of the work. You don't muscle a maul, you aim it and get out of its way. The frozen wood cracked clean when he hit the grain right, a sound like a pistol shot in the still air, the two halves falling away in a straight line. Green wood would have fought him, fibers clinging, the blade buried, requiring a wedge and a second strike to finish the job. But this was seasoned pine, cold-hardened, and it split honest. He worked for 2 hours. He stacked the cord against her west wall where the morning sun would hit it first and keep it dry. He left before dawn. His boot prints froze in the mud by her woodpile. She found the wood at first light. She said nothing, and then, on the road back from town that Thursday afternoon, Ruth Ames stopped her buggy. She was a small woman, white hair pinned low with bone hairpins, her carved walking stick propped beside her on the seat. She looked at Thomas Cole, standing in the road with those pale blue eyes, watery but sharp, always sharp. And she said 6 words. "She hasn't made 2 cups since James." Then she flicked the reins and drove on. Thomas stood in the road for a full minute. The dust settled around his boots, and the afternoon light stretched his shadow east across the ruts. That was the first time Ruth Ames spoke. She had 2 left. October turned the valley the color of old brass, and Clara Dunning began preparing for winter like it was a war she intended to win. Thomas Cole stood in the road for another 30 seconds after Ruth Ames's buggy disappeared around the bend. Then he walked home, put on his dark charcoal vest, and came back to Clara's ranch before noon. He didn't explain why. She didn't ask. They started with the barn foundation. Now, if you've never banked a barn for winter, here's what you need to understand. Cold doesn't just come through the walls. It comes up. Frozen ground conducts heat out of a structure like a wick draws oil. You lose more warmth through the foundation than through every gap in the siding combined. So what you do is pack straw, not loose, not tossed, packed, tight, a full 18 inches thick against the base. Then you layer earth over it. Packed earth, not shoveled. Packed. Thomas used the flat back of an axe head. Clara used a section of oak post cut to 14 inches, driving it down into the mix like she was tamping a fence hole. The straw acts as insulation. The earth holds it in place and sheds water. You work your way around the entire perimeter, and when you're done, you press your palm flat against the inside wall at floor level. If you can feel a draft, you missed a section. They went around twice. No drafts. The fence line took 4 days. 23 weak posts identified in that flour-dusted notebook, and every single one got pulled, redug, and reset. Clara had a method by now. She'd press her palm flat against the post, fingers spread wide, and feel for play. Any post that moved more than a 1/4 inch at the top was coming out. Thomas learned this on the 2nd day and never questioned it again. The soil along the south line was half clay and half gravel, which sounds like it'd hold a post, but actually fights you. Clay swells when it's wet, shrinks when it's dry, and gravel gives no lateral support on its own. So you dig 30 inches deep, set the post, pack 6 inches of gravel for drainage, then alternate layers of clay and crushed rock, tamping each layer with your boot heel before adding the next. 8 layers. Takes 20 minutes per post if you don't rush. They didn't rush. The hay crib got raised on the 12th day. This is the detail that separates someone who survives winter from someone who watches their cattle starve in February. Hay stored flat on the ground will wick moisture up from frozen earth. The bottom 6 inches turn to rot by January, and rot spreads upward. You lose a 1/4 of your feed to mold, sometimes more. 6 inches of air circulation, that's all it takes. Cedar blocks, because cedar resists moisture, cut to uniform height so the crib sits level. Clara had Thomas check each block with a straight edge while she shimmed the low ones with thin cedar wedges. 48,000 pounds of hay she'd put up herself. Thomas had contributed another 7,200 from his own cutting. 55,200 pounds total. She wrote the number in the notebook that evening by lamplight, her left hand steady, the leather cover soft and flour-dusted under her fingertips. That notebook became a nightly ritual. Hay stored, firewood, 4.2 cords split and stacked, bark side up to shed rain. Fence posts replaced, 23 of 31. Barn temperature at 6 in the morning, barn temperature at 6 in the evening. The numbers filled page after page in her tight, slanted handwriting, and the ledger grew fat with proof that she was ready. Henry Pace rode up on October 23rd. Give the man this much. He looked at what Clara had built and didn't pretend he wasn't impressed. He dismounted, hooked his thumbs in his belt, that folded land survey map tucked in his tan vest like always, and he studied the banked barn, the raised hay crib, the new fence posts along the south line. Then he offered partnership. Not the land this time, something closer. Marriage, implied in the architecture of the sentence, but never quite spoken. The way a man builds a door frame and leaves out the door. Clara stood with her weight forward on the balls of her feet, that dark auburn braid falling past her shoulder blades, pale green eyes level. 3 words. I'll think about it. She didn't think about it. Henry rode off with his back straight and his jaw tight, and the dimple in his left cheek didn't show once because he never smiled. He knew the answer before he asked. Some men ask anyway, just to close the book. That evening, Clara and Thomas sat at her kitchen table. Bean broth, thick with onion and salt pork. Biscuits she'd made that morning. The good ones, the ones where the butter was cold enough. Coffee in 2 cups. The iron stove ticked as it cooled. Flour canister on the counter, half full. The window faced east toward Thomas's land, and the last light came through it low and amber. Their hands nearly touched, reaching for the same biscuit. Neither pulled away. Neither said a word about it. Thomas's thumb found the brass pocket watch on its tarnished chain, rubbing the case once, and then his hand was still. The kitchen is where truth is spoken, and sometimes the truth is 2 cups of coffee that nobody explains. Before we go on, I want to know, where are you listening from today? Drop your country in the comments. It means something to me. Now, the reason I tell you that is because of what happened 5 days later. A county livestock inspector named Garner rode onto Clara's property on October 28th. White-haired, no-nonsense, hands like old rope. He checked her fence tension by pressing his palm flat against the wire. He felt the hay for moisture, pulling a fistful from the center of the stack and rubbing it between his fingers. He opened her ledger and read 3 pages without expression. He counted her cattle. He did not praise. Your south line will hold. 5 words. Clara nodded. That was the inspection. The first snow falls on November 9th. By November 11th, the temperature drops to 4 degrees below zero. Everything Clara had built, every post, every patch, every number in that ledger was about to be tested by something that didn't care about any of it. The storm arrives. The storm hit Elk Fall on November 12th, 1887, and it did not ask permission. It came off the northwest ridge like something with weight behind it, something personal. And by 6 in the morning, the temperature had cratered to 11 below zero. Not 4 below, not 8, 11. The kind of cold that doesn't just freeze water, it freezes the idea of water. The wind hit the barn broadside, and the whole structure groaned, a low sound like a ship taking a wave. And Clara Dunning stood inside that barn at dawn with her palm-sized leather notebook open in her left hand, the edges flour-dusted and worn soft, and she wrote the first entry of the storm. Barn temperature, 28 degrees, holding. Firewood consumed overnight, more than expected. She had budgeted 1/5 of a cord per day. The actual burn rate was closer to 1/4. That overage, that single extra 20th of a cord, sat in her chest like a stone. She did the math twice by lantern light. At 1/4 cord per day, her supply would last, but not with the margin she wanted. Not with the margin that let her sleep. Hay-fed, 390 pounds across 14 head. She wrote that number and underlined it. Snow fell at 2 inches per hour for the first 6 hours. Then it slowed to 1. Then it picked up again around midnight like it had only been resting. But here's what held. Every single post along that south fence, every one she and Thomas had set together, tamped with bootfuls of rock and packed clay, sighted down the line until the angle was dead true, did not shift. Not one. The wire stayed taut. The tension held. You could press your palm flat against it and feel the resistance. The same resistance it had the day they strung it. Those posts had been set deep into half-clay soil, packed in layers, not all at once, and they were doing exactly what they were built to do. The raised hay crib, the one Clara had insisted on, 2 feet off the ground on cedar runners, kept every bale dry. 3 miles east, a neighbor whose name doesn't matter to this story had stacked his hay on bare ground because it was easier, because it was faster, because he figured the tarp would be enough. By November 14th, moisture was wicking up through the bottom bales. By the 16th, the center of that stack was warm to the touch, spoiling. That man would lose a third of his winter feed to a decision he made in September because he didn't want to build a crib. Clara's barn foundation, banked with earth and straw before the first frost, held heat the way a clay oven holds heat. Steady, patient. And the stove, that same stove with the dead spot at the rear, the one that had burned her first pie back in August, she knew its temper now. She rotated the firebox load every 40 minutes, feeding the hot side, starving the cool side, maintaining an even burn that kept the kitchen at a temperature where coffee stayed warm in the cup. Then November 15th came, and the northwest corner of the barn roof started to leak. That section, the one patched twice before winter. Snow had piled on the north face, melted against the spot where the old shingles met the new patch, and found its way through, drip by drip, onto stored grain. Clara heard it before she saw it, a soft ticking sound in the loft that didn't belong to the wind. She climbed the ladder in the dark with a bundle of cedar shingles under one arm and a tin of pine tar in her jacket pocket. Thomas Cole was behind her, holding the lantern high, its light swaying with each gust that shook the frame. His brass pocket watch on its tarnished chain caught the light as he steadied himself against a crossbeam. The repair is not complicated to describe. It is complicated to do at 2 in the morning, with wind cutting through every gap in the roof like a knife. You overlap the shingles against the wind direction, always against, never with, because wind will peel a shingle laid with the grain the way you'd peel bark off a birch. The pine tar has to be warm to spread. In 11 below air, pine tar is essentially stone. Clara worked the tin between her palms, pressing it, rolling it, until the tar softened enough to smear across the shingle's edge. She laid the first cedar piece over the leak, pressed it flat with both hands, and held it. You hold until the tar grips. 30 seconds, a minute. The cold tries to convince you it's enough before it is. She held longer. Then she overlapped the second shingle, sealed the seam, pressed again. Thomas held the lantern steady and said nothing. The patch held. It held that night and every night after. If you've made it this far into the storm with Clara and Thomas, you're the kind of listener I make these stories for. Hit subscribe if you haven't, and if you have, share this with someone who needs a good story tonight. Now, the reason I tell you that is because of what happened on the 7th night, November 18th. Thomas's brass pocket watch stopped at 2:14 a.m. He sat at Clara's kitchen table, winding the crown with his thumb, turning it slowly, listening for the click of the mainspring catching. It didn't catch. Clara sat across from him. The stove ticked. Wind pressed against the windows like a hand testing a door. 2 cups of coffee sat on the table, steam rising in thin lines. The ledger lay open between them, its pages filled with 7 days of numbers: temperatures, hay weights, firewood tallies, cattle counts. Neither spoke. The kitchen was warm, and the rest of the world was not, and that was the whole of it. Clara reached across the table and placed her hand on his forearm. 5 seconds. She pulled back. Neither spoke. That was the first time she touched him. It was also the last time either of them pretended this was about pie. On the morning of November 19th, the storm breaks. Clara opens her barn door to count cattle. All 14 are standing. The south fence, every post, is holding. She opens the ledger and writes one line: all accounted for. Thomas is standing behind her. She doesn't turn around. She says one word: stay. He says, yes. The narrator holds that moment for a full 5 seconds of silence. The town of Elk Fall dug itself out of the storm of 1887 the way small towns always do. One shovel at a time, one neighbor at a time, one story at a time. And the story they couldn't stop telling was about Clara Dunning's south fence. Now, here's what the valley looked like when the snow pulled back. The Mercer Ranch lost 6 head, 6 cattle frozen where they stood because the hay had been stacked against bare ground and the moisture wicked up through the bottom bales and turned feed into rot. Patterson's place? Worse. The entire hay supply gone to ground moisture and a barn roof that buckled under the weight of wet snow because the crossbeams hadn't been re-notched since the summer of '84. 2 ranches bleeding. Good people, decent operations, but the margins weren't there. Clara lost 0 head. 0. 14 cattle standing in a barn that held its temperature because the gaps had been chinked with a mixture of mud and straw that a man with gray-blue eyes and deliberate hands had packed at 2 in the morning by lantern light. The hay stayed dry on raised cribs. The firewood lasted because someone had tracked consumption in a flour-dusted notebook, projected versus actual, day by day, in a hand that never lied. The ledger's numbers made the argument before any person could. Nobody needed an opinion about Clara Dunning's ranch. The math was already talking. 3 days after the storm broke, Henry Pace rode up. Sandy blonde hair clean under his hat, that folded land survey map tucked inside his tan leather vest like always, polished boots that had no business looking that good after a storm like that. He dismounted at the south fence line, didn't say a word, just walked to the nearest post, one of those cedar posts Thomas had set at 3.5 feet deep in half-clay soil, tamped in layers of packed rock and clay, plumbed to true, and wrapped his hand around it and pushed. It didn't move. He pushed harder. The post didn't give a 1/4 inch. Henry Pace stood there with his hand on that post and looked down the line. Every post standing, every wire taut, the tension exactly what it should be when you press your palm flat and feel for that firm, even resistance that means the wire will flex in wind but never sag. He nodded once. That nod was the town's verdict. Not on the fence, on everything. Henry tipped his hat toward the porch where Clara stood with her dark auburn braid over one shoulder, pale green eyes watching him without expression. He mounted. He rode away. He did not return to offer anything. He didn't need to. The gesture was complete. And I'll tell you something. That was the most honest thing Henry Pace ever did. The man had good land and good teeth and not a damn thing to be ashamed of. He just finally understood that some fences aren't built for him. Before we go on, I want to know what country you're listening from today. Drop it in the comments. I read every single one, and it means more than you think. Now, the reason I tell you that is because of what happened at the first Sunday supper after the storm. The gathering hall was full. Folks were tired, mud-stained, grateful to be sitting at a table that wasn't shaking. Ruth Ames sat at her usual place at the end of the last table, her carved walking stick, dark with age, leaning against her knee, those pale blue eyes watching from beneath thin brows. Clara and Thomas sat near each other for the first time in public. Not touching, not speaking, just near. Close enough that their elbows could have brushed if either one reached for the salt. Ruth looked at Thomas, at that charcoal vest, that brass pocket watch chain catching the lamplight, and she said 6 words. You said yes before she finished the sentence. The room went quiet. Every spoon stopped. Ruth returned to her broth like she'd commented on the weather. That was the second time she spoke in this story. She had one left. Spring of '88 came slow and muddy, and Clara and Thomas did what 2 people do when the pretending is over. They merged their fence lines. If this story is keeping you company, leave a like. It means more than you know. The work took 3 weeks. They pulled the dividing posts between their properties one by one, levering each one out of the ground with a bar and a patience that looked a lot like ceremony. They restrung wire along a new shared perimeter, 800 acres now running as one operation. Thomas drove posts. Clara sighted the line. Neither corrected the other anymore. They didn't need to. The notebook, flour-dusted, edges worn soft, was full. Clara started a second one, and in that second notebook, Thomas's name appeared in the margins for the first time. Not as a neighbor, as a column header. The wedding was in 1889, in the gathering hall. Clara wore a cream dress. Thomas wore a clean version of the same charcoal vest, the brass pocket watch on its tarnished chain in its usual pocket. Ruth Ames stood with her walking stick and looked at Thomas with those watery, sharp eyes and said, "You've been a good man for 11 years. Maybe it's time to be a happy one." That was the last time Ruth Ames spoke in this story. She'd said everything she ever needed to in 19 words across 2 years. Final image: a porch at sunset, 1894. 2 chairs, 2 cups of coffee, a dark auburn braid gone lighter at the temples, a brass pocket watch on a tarnished chain, still keeping time. The notebook is on its 4th volume. The stove's dead spot is still there. Clara still rotates. The ranch is 800 acres and every payment is made on time. A young adult cousin helps with the cattle now, out past the south fence that has never once needed resetting. Clara looks at Thomas and says, "Who made this apple pie?" Thomas doesn't look up. "You did," he says. 14 Tuesdays ago, and every one since. She takes his hand. They said she'd never stop running. They were right about one thing. She never did stop. She just finally found someone worth running toward. May God bless each and every one of you who listened today. Until next time, keep riding.